Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's press conference. And I hand over to our President, Gianni Pittella, and then we take questions afterwards.
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I want to talk about three things. First of all, the Council, the summit that's coming up. I want, on behalf of my group, to denounce the disgraceful inertia, if not a clear desire to delay, about the emergency with refugees and migrants. We've had thousands of people dead or drowned in the Mediterranean on our continent for years. And the Council is not just not putting through its commitments on relocation, it's stopping any revision of the Dublin regulation. The Dublin Treaty needs to be revised if we need to have an overall system for managing migratory flows. President Juncker is talking about sanctions now. I think they're going to be adopted in the Commission meeting today or tomorrow. We've been saying this for some time. Decisions have to be respected and implemented as well as taken. I would have preferred a political agreement so that everybody put the relocation scheme into effect without need for sanctions. We need institutions and legal channels for migration. Legal channels are a fundamental instrument to avoid these deaths. We need a harmonized European system which is effective and allows immigrants to respond to demand for labour in individual member states, which is why we want a system like the blue card for non-specialized workers. The second question I want to address is Africa. Terrorism and climate change. Poverty and inequality are among the main causes, among the roots for thousands of young Africans coming to Europe looking for a more worthwhile existence. I've often said, and I'll go on saying, that if we want to address migratory phenomena without a long-term strategy for Africa, we're not going to achieve it. Until you address the original causes upstream, then you can build as many walls and barriers and borders as you like. You won't stop a continent of millions of people who are looking for a dignified future from coming to look for it here. We need a real partnership strategy with Africa, and that's the policy priority for us, which is why we welcome High Representative Mogherini's commitment to spend 50 million euros on the fight against terrorism and Boko Haram, helping the G20 and the Sahel countries. We need other initiatives in education and job creation, but on those the member states unhappily are turning a deaf ear to the idea of the trust fund to be paid for from contributions from member states. And as you'll know, only some member states have contributed. It's my duty, politically and morally, to fight for Africa, which is why I went myself to Nigeria, Guinea-Conakry, Ethiopia and Sudan, and recently I've also been in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the political and humanitarian and human rights situation is heading for collapse. This is why at the plenary we're tabling a resolution calling for individual sanctions as envisaged under the Cotonou Agreement. We think the summit in November between EU and Africa is fundamental. This is in Côte d'Ivoire, and we're going to have the President of Côte d'Ivoire speaking tomorrow, and I shall have the pleasure of meeting him in a bilateral. Last point is country-by-country report. I want to denounce the serious attitude of the Liberals and the EPP, who are trying to slow down this important transparency progress on tax. There are lots of calls to be heard for transparency on tax. But when you come to country-by-country reporting, suddenly people start putting spokes in the wheels of this exercise, which allows you to see where companies, big multinational companies, are making their profits. Citizens have to pay taxes where they're earned, where the income is earned. Liberals and the People's Party have introduced a safeguard clause, which, if it isn't changed, as we're going to try to change it in the plenary, will allow multinationals not to publish data that are regarded as sensitive for an unlimited period of time. That's frankly serious. It's a devastating message that is being sent to Europe's citizens.
Grazie Gianni Pittella.
Thank you.
For your questions, if you have any. Yes, please indicate the medium and you're working for Max.
Max Hoffman, Deutsche Welle. Mr. Pittella, do you have, in the light of what's happening in the UK at the moment, do you have any hope that the Brexit negotiations might be concluded in a more or less positive way in the time frame until March 2019? Thank you.
Questa è la nostra speranza.
Well, we hope so, and that's what we're aiming at. But if there's a delay, it's not going to be our fault. It will be because of this insanely relaxed attitude of the British Prime Minister, who thought she was going to win out big. And this happened. What happened with her was that she didn't need early elections. She decided to call them because she thought she was going to win big, and now she finds herself forced, having lost out, to try to form a government with an extreme right organisation, having lost strength. It's inexplicable. I think British voters did well to punish her attitude. But we're ready to open negotiations tomorrow. We have a clear position. We voted it through Parliament with a big majority. Our position is shared by Council and the Commission. And Mrs. May shouldn't be coming to ask us for anything. We're ready. We're ready to negotiate respecting the rights of European and British citizens under the best possible conditions. We were never in favour of a hard Brexit.
Salvatore Lussu dell'ANSA. I media
Answer. British media are talking about secret contacts between Labour's and Tory to achieve a soft Brexit. Have you any news about these contacts? Are you indeed encouraging them?
Parlerò con Corbyn.
I'll be talking with Corbyn very probably at 1 o'clock, among other things, to congratulate him personally and to invite him to the Socialist Group's plenary meeting. I have not heard any news of secret meetings. I prefer a fair Brexit. I don't like talking about soft or hard Brexit. What I want is a fair, a right Brexit, a fair Brexit, one that satisfies expectations and recognises the rights of European citizens living in the United Kingdom and also those of the British citizens living in Europe, and makes it possible for the UK to pay what it's committed to paying, that makes it possible to overcome borders, and makes it, if possible, also possible for the UK to stay in the customs union and the trading system through ensuring freedom of movement, through safeguarding freedom of movement.
Ivo Ghezzi, il Corriere della Sera.
Corriere della Sera. On this tax amendment, you've said everything. It's a scandal. You're going to do everything you can to change it. So in broad terms, you've covered the situation. So there's nothing to add. But let me address a different subject. You're chair of European Socialists, but you're also a man of great experience at European level. If you look at the European Parliament site, if a citizen goes there and reads what members of the European Parliament have as emoluments, there's a general expenses allowance, basically for running their offices. Computers, telephone bills, that kind of stuff. But if you look at the internal list of how members of Parliament spend their money, then you see office expenses are listed there, and then there's a representation allowance, an entertainment allowance, which cannot be higher than the entertainment allowance for the President, Vice Presidents, Commissioners, and so on. So logically, only part of this 4,300 euros can be spent on entertainment. But now that this has emerged, don't you think that members of the European Parliament who misrepresent their expenses ought to be made to pay them back? Because the sum is not small. It can be 50,000 euros a year, 40,000 of which come from taxpayers. So that's my first question on this possible refund. And then yesterday, a working party was set up to reform the procedures for these payments. And this working party has set the end of the year for making a proposal, which means that for the whole of this term of office, there will be no correction to this system within Parliament, and there might be one only in the next Parliament. Don't you think this is a mistake, above all in terms of the doubts that have been created by it? And incidentally, your group has its Vice President Sassoli within the Working Party. Shouldn't your group be pushing for an immediate reform for this allowance and the system of paying it? Well, as you know, these expenses are a flat rate allowance. So each member has to keep receipts for what he spent, but of course it's not easy to keep all the receipts for what you spend. What's important is that the expenses be incurred on the list of things, not only the office that you mentioned, but other things as well. But I live a very intense life as a parliamentarian, and I think thousands of people know that, and every week I go around Italy, and not just Italy, and I spend money on the list of things that have been established for spending that allowance by the Conference of Presidents, by the Bureau rather. So I have no doubts about the legitimacy of these expenses, which are in line with what the Bureau specifies, at least as far as I'm concerned. Of course, I can't inquire into what colleagues do, but I have every faith in them. I think it's right to change the system, precisely in order to achieve more transparency. So I think the Bureau did well to set up a working party, and we, the Bureau that is of the Socialist Group, will be thinking about this subject today in order to feed our contribution into the debate in the Working Party of the Parliament. I think it would be possible to move faster, so that Parliament could have a first reform, the first set of changes in the system in the course of this term of office. And obviously, starting with the next Parliament, then you could have a more deep-rooted reform.
Anna Vandensky in Brussels, diplomatic. Mr. Pittella, you said about sanctions against the countries who are not eager to relocate the migrants, but we understand it's also a very complicated legal question. It's not only a political question. So what are your immediate proposals for all these people who work in the centers, in hotspots, receiving migrants who are coming by hundreds or thousands weekly? I mean, in your country, in Italy.
Well, as I said, I did not prefer this solution, which was sanctions. Because the normal way forward is to decide on a relocation scheme for refugees and then to act. That's the normal way to proceed. You decide on things together and you then take action. But it's clear to me that for a year and a half now, people are not acting on this program in several countries, and the European Commission thinks that a sanction is necessary. That's not what I preferred, that I didn't want to get that far. But when we look at the welcome centers, our concern here as well, we've often visited them, is that human rights situations need to be inspected. Refugees are people, just as we are people. And they need to leave in decent conditions, the most decent possible. And our attention will always be strongly concentrated on this, on human rights.
Question before we have to close. Davide?
David Carretta, Radio Radicale.
Radicale. President Pittella, on another internal file within the Parliament, the possible destruction and rebuilding of the EPS building in Brussels with a cost of 430 million minimum. What is your group's position on that?
So che ieri sera non è stata presa nessuna decisione.
You know that no decision has been made yet. I recommended to the vice presidents, the Socialists, to request further technical studies be done to go into greater depth, because the studies that have been done up until now are not all going in the same direction. They show considerable differences. And before we make a decision that will have two consequences, one of which will be safety, because it's obvious that anyone who goes to the Parliament, not just MEPs, assistants, journalists, normal citizens, deserve going to a building which is safe, and then secondly, an issue concerning citizens. If we are obliged to spend so high a figure, it needs to be fully motivated, justified. We need to know exactly why we're spending this money. And there shouldn't be alternatives that would allow us to do the same thing and to guarantee security without spending 400 or 500 million. So we socialists are not in favor of acting right away without there having been further technical studies done, on the basis of which we could then set the question to the parliamentary group and to the plenary and to have a decision made by the whole parliament.
Thank you. If there are more questions, we can take them outside. Have a good week.